verse 8 is where we're going to start. And I've kind of jumped around on James, but I did it on his thoughts were coming
That's
together.
why your back hurts?
Yeah. He says in James 4:8, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. James wasn't running for office, obviously. He didn't really try to mince the words. He just absolutely told it the way it was. And when I read that, I thought about this one man one time, and I might have mentioned that this morning, but he said, if you don't feel as close to God as you once did, rest assured it's not God who's moved. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly right. And so I thought about what David said to Solomon, and if you want to turn over there with me, it's fine, or else I'll read it to you, but it's in First Chronicles. And he tried to make, David had tremendous wisdom from God, and he would say things, and we might look at it and think, well, that's kind of harsh, but he was just simply speaking the truth. So in First Chronicles chapter 28 is where I want to read from, as he writes to Solomon, his son. 28 and verse 9. He said, as for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. And as I read that, that's kind of what James is saying in his writings. The people of the world, they just simply don't care, it seems to me like. But God doesn't want us to serve him partially. Tanya was telling about the restaurant that they went to, and she ordered eggs, but she didn't order the eggshells, and she got them anyway. Well, that's because someone doesn't do their job properly. And I think sometimes I don't look at being a Christian as a job, but it has responsibilities. We have duties to God, responsibilities, and it troubles me when I see sometimes the lack of respect, diligence, and all those different things as far as serving God's concerned. Because I don't know if people really stop and think about it, but we're serving God. It's not some man, it's not some office or something. We're serving God, the Creator, and that ought to be done with great respect and great consideration, and also with fear. Because I've said it many times. My daddy was a little bit larger than what I am, but I feared him, not from the standpoint that he was going to physically harm me, but I didn't want to disappoint him. And he had authority, and he was my father. Certainly would never have stood up against him. If I had, it wouldn't worked out well anyway. But the admonition that James is giving to us here in this section, to me there's four different parts to it. The first part is he tells us to resist the devil. Resist the devil. And I don't know when the person came up with this little conception of Satan, of the devil, being some character in red pajamas, but that's not Satan. And we can see Satan in society. That little girl that got killed over there in the area where Sherry and Lance live, Paradise area. I watched just a little bit of that stuff on the news, and that guy was pure evil. Just pure evil. And really, he's not nearly as bad as some of them are. And we don't realize how bad Satan has no conscience. He plays by no rules. And so when James is addressing the brethren here in this book, he's wanting to get the picture of what Satan really is and giving the people the way to overcome that. So it says, resist the devil. And you know, James would know about this better than most of us. Most of the time, law-breaking people, they have no conscience. People that are going to do really harm to the individual, they don't care. It doesn't matter to them whether there's a God or not. Their minds are warped and bad, but they're also, a lot of times, they're cowards. And I've seen that so many different times. When we had that crisis center there in Graham, when we started that, and those ladies would come in down to the facility, and we had it fixed up very, very nice, and had individual rooms for them to stay in. We had a nice kitchen. They came to a good place, but they were coming because they were married to cowards, to men that would think that they could become a bigger man by beating up a woman, and that always made me so sick. You know, I couldn't hardly stand to think about it. Well, Satan, he doesn't care who he harms, who he hurts, what he does. He has no conscience. So James says, resist him, and he said, if you do that, he'll flee from you. And that's the case. He realizes, and in fact, I'm going to mention this, and we'll go back to it again in a little bit. But where did Satan come from? You know the answer. He was an angel. He fought against Michael there in heaven and lost the battle and got kicked out. And so that kind of tells you the kind of character that Satan is. And I realize that he's not a physical being, he's a spiritual being, but he still has the powers that we read about in the scriptures. So James says, resist him, he'll flee from you. And then also in this section, he says, stay close to God. You stay close to God. That's something else that I've noticed in my years on this planet. People that are evil, that aren't godly people, they don't want to be anywhere near godly people. They'll say their little things and they'll act foolishly and all that, but it's always kind of amused me because even though they think they're big and bold and bad, they actually fear goodness in God. They realize that God has power. And so James says if you just stay close to God, then God will come close to you. And that's the way it works. But you don't get close to God in a physical way. And I think that it's kind of probably would be a surprise to some people, especially those that have never read a Bible, what Luke says in Acts 17:28. He says, for in him, talking about God, well, in fact, let's verse 27, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of our own poets have said, for we are also his children. So God's not far from us. And I don't think that some people, it's like, well, I can't see God. He's somewhere up there in heaven, so I can do what I want to down here on this earth. Well, God is a spirit. He can take on shapes and forms, as we know it when we read in the Old Testament. But he's everywhere. You can't go far enough to get away from God. And so I think we need to realize that he not only is everywhere, he hears every word we speak. He knows every thought that goes through our minds. And that's kind of a sobering thought to me. That one of the things about raising our kids up in Graham that I liked was we were pretty well known. And if one of our kids did something, I didn't have to be there to see him, because I'd have 40 eyes throughout that town that would report on him, you know, and tell me. And they knew that. And so it made it a little easier for us to do our job as parents. But we get near to God in several ways. I want to read a couple other scriptures. So Deuteronomy 4 and verse 7 was another one that I looked at this morning, or this evening rather. And Moses tells us there in that place, he said, for what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God whenever we call on him? And you know, this is what I never have been able to understand idolatry. I don't understand Islam. They want to worship a false god that can do nothing, and then, you know, look down upon us who worship the true God, the living God. I also want to read Psalm 139, 8 through 10. David wrote some things there that I read again today, and I liked what he said. It was a good reminder. He said, if I ascend to heaven, well, in fact, let's start at verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. So God is everywhere. And I think that there are so many people that they want to put God in some kind of a box, and he's not that. He's something totally different from that. So we have to, even as Christians, I think sometimes we allow ourselves to think, well, I'm not in church, or I'm not around the brethren, so I can be a little more naughty, you know. Well, you can't. You can't. And so how do you get near to God? And I thought about 3 different ways. Number one is by studying his word. If I want to really know somebody, then I'll spend some time with them and studying them and learning, you know, about them. And we can do that with God by studying his word. Another way that we can get near to God is by worshiping him. Because when you worship, you open up your heart, you're inviting God in, you're exposing yourself to him. He already knows, but we still have to, I think, initiate that. We worship him in spirit and in truth. And that's one of the things that I think is neglected in the religious world today, in so many places. We read in the scriptures there one time where the one said, well, what is truth? Well, it's not what you make it, it's what God makes it. And so when we worship him in truth, if I am doing something wrong, I want to do it where I'm around somebody, around people who don't know me. Because I don't want to face the consequences for it. We have to be held accountable. And I understand that God is everywhere, and so no matter what I do or what I say or what I think, God knows, and that's good. And then the third way to really get to near to God is by serving him faithfully. And you know, I've never really understood why that it's so difficult to try to motivate people to be in church at every moment, at every time that it meets. I've never understood that, and I don't talk about it. I don't try to beat somebody over the head with it, because I think if you do that, then their worship is it's going to be in vain anyway. They're doing it because they feel like they have to, rather than because they want to. But I thought about something else too, and in a lot of ways, our relationship with God is like a marriage relationship. And I thought about that this afternoon, and I think you'll see what I mean in just a second. When I've counseled with married couples that were having problems, I like to get them not together but separate and talk to them and ask them some questions. What is and I'm not talking about sexual things, understand that. What is the thing that you do that pleases your husband or your wife the most? And it's always amazed me how they really don't know. So many of them don't. Well, I don't know. I don't know what it really is that pleases her. And they'll come up with some kind of things like, when I mow the yard or wash the clothes. They have to think. And then another thing I always ask them is, when is the last time that you told them sincerely that you love them? I'm not talking about just flippant stuff. I'm talking about deeply. When's the last time? And I saw this joke, but it's so true. This guy's wife complained because he didn't tell her that he loved her very often. And she complained about it, and he said, I told you that I loved you when we first got married. If I change my mind, I'll let you know. And that's the attitude sometimes. And that's what I'm saying, like with God, it's kind of the same way with God. When's the last time that you sat down and prayed and said, God, I love you. I really love you. God wants to hear that, I think. When's the last time, and this is another question I'll ask these couples when I can visit with them. When's the last time that you and your spouse got off by yourselves and had a really meaningful conversation? And you'd be amazed how that a lot of couples, they just never really talk to each other. They might scream or holler or, berate one another, but they don't really sit down and have a meaningful conversation. I think you need to know what's going on in the other person's mind, what their needs are, how you can meet them. And most husbands and wives would have to come up with, they'd have trouble trying to, and most of them would say, well, why are those things important? And I've heard that, So anyway, I think that we need to spend time with God and just say to God, God, I love you, and I want to serve you, and I want to please you, and I need for you to help me to do that. And we do that in worship. We do that in our prayer closets. We do that when we read and study our word. All of those things are important. That's why James says, draw near to God, and he'll draw near to you. And, during one of Israel's periods of faithfulness to God, and that's a sad statement, they had periods of faithfulness. A Christian can't be faithful just on occasion. A Christian has to be faithful all the time. But Moses said to Israel, behold, I've taught you statutes and ordinances, even as Jehovah my God commanded me, that you should do them in the midst of the land, whither you go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them. For this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people that shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so nigh to them as Jehovah our God, whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that hath statutes and ordinance so righteous as all this law which I set before you this day? And so Moses is saying, look, and can you imagine going into a country? I had friends that used to go to India. We had the churches that we worked with. They had some orphanages over there, and I never went. I never wanted to go. But they would tell me, you go over there, and some of these countries, they worship animals. They treat them as gods. The culture is so weird, so different from what ours is. And they said it was really hard to get used to that, dealing with that. Because with us, if we find somebody that we think that might be interested in becoming a Christian, well, we're always on this pretty well on the same page. We both understand who God is and what God does. But those idolatrous nations like that, they don't. And so, I was thinking about what in Exodus 19:22, whenever the priest would go to the sanctuary, it was said that they were drawing nigh to God. And I like that thought. They go to the sanctuary because they felt like in the sanctuary or the temple, whatever you want to call it, that's where that they went and met God. And so Peter tells us that we are priests and that we're privileged to approach God in worship. And he says we should come nearer to him in worship. And in order to do that, and I'm not trying to be crude about this, but there are people in the church that never really have understood how to worship. They look at it as though it's a duty or an obligation. They come and they'll sit through the service and be respectful. But to me, worship is when you come to God and you just open up your heart and you say, God, fix what's broken. Make me whole. Remove the stuff that doesn't belong there. Put me back in the right relationship with you. Because I think so many times the people have lost the feeling of the importance of worshiping God, of elevating him and emptying themselves and just saying, God, I want you in me. Whatever it takes, I want you in me. And I don't think people think about that anymore. Sometimes I think people think it's an obligation rather than a privilege to worship God. That church that I was baptized in years ago, like I told those of you that were here this morning, when I was baptized, that was the very first time we'd ever set foot inside that building. I didn't even know who the preacher was. Didn't know any of the people there. And so we went, and I absolutely had no intention that day of making any kind of commitment to God. Didn't have any idea at all that I would do that. And so when I sat there and I listened to what the man said, I didn't know him. And it wasn't him, it was the Word. And that Word just reached into my heart. And I said, man, I got to do something. Well, I think there are a lot of people, even people in the church, that never come to that point. It's a mechanical action, more or less. We go to church, but they don't really let God in and take over their heart and get into those inner places and get rid of all the things that don't need to be there. And to me, that's what worship is all about. And that's why I say some, I think, feel like it's an obligation rather than a privilege. I'm really struggling right now with the idea, and even with my granddaughter and her husband. They want to be good parents so bad, and they want to please their children, and they want to have this closeness. And so the kids, the boys, and I've not been to see one of their ball games, but evidently they're pretty good athletes. And so my granddaughter seems to think, well, we need to really focus on that because this is really important to them. You know, my daddy never asked me one time in my life, what's important to you, Dwayne Arthur? He never asked me that. He decided what was important for me. Taught me how to be a man, taught me how to work. There are kids today that have no earthly idea how to work. And I'm not talking about youngsters, I'm talking about 20-year-old boys and girls. Started working when I was 15 and I've never stopped. But it's with worship, you can't take and set worship aside and say, okay, God, I'll get back with you, but today I got a ball game over in a town 50 miles from here. You can't do that. And people are teaching their children that. When the writer in Hebrews said, don't forsake the assembly, as the manner of some is, he meant what he said. And we need to understand that. Well, then there's another passage there in James that I wanted to look at. and you're familiar with this passage, but he said in James 4 and verse 8, draw near to God, he'll draw near to you. And he said, cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. This is a symbolic thing, I understand that. But if your children, or say you invite somebody to your house to eat a meal with you, they sit down at the table and you look over there and their hands are filthy. Or if you go to a place to eat and they're serving the food and you see the server's hands are nasty, dirty, you gonna eat it? I'm not going to. I've had salmonella and I don't want any more of it. And so when James says, cleanse your hands, you sinners. Again, that's figurative language. We understand that. But he says, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. And there are a lot of people in the world that think that they can live in both worlds. They can be serving God and yet living in the world. And Paul said, you're in the world, but you're not of it. And that's so very important. I think that worship has lost its importance to so many people, and they look at it as an obligation rather than a privilege. And I think that's the reason why that they can ignore it so easily. So when he said, James says, cleanse your hands, purify your hearts, and this is something that I really struggle with because when I was growing up, I can think back to when I was probably 3 years old or 4 years old. I have to remember things back there. And we lived, in a little town. And I never really understood what a person had to do to become a Christian, even though we went to different churches and I was an acolyte in the Episcopal church. Still don't know what that was, but I was one. But when James is talking here, he says, humble yourself in the presence of God and the Lord, and He'll exalt you. And so, but he talks about this being double-minded and cleansing ourselves. Double-minded means that a person tries to have two minds, one that loves the Lord and one that loves the world, and thinks, well, I can separate those two things, but you can't. You can't do it. It's impossible. If you love the world, you can't love God. And there's two scriptures that I'll show you that I think are important. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, 14 through 18. I think I referred to this one just a moment ago, but we'll go to it anyway. Paul said, now God has not only raised the Lord, but also raised us up through his power. And so, he's referring to, of course, the resurrection of Christ. And then he's talking about raising us up when he returns, as Paul talks about there in the letter to the church at Thessalonica. He's going to return. And he's going to raise us up, and we're going to receive our new bodies. But it says, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make the members of a prostitute? May it never be. Or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says, the two shall become one flesh, but the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. And so when people are double-minded, they think, well, I can be married to the world during the week, but on the weekend, then I'm going to go to church. Well, you can't do that. You can do it, but it's meaningless. If you're married to someone, and they say, well, I'll be your husband on the weekends, but during the week I'm going to go with another person. Well, you can't do that. You got to be one with God. And so when Paul talks about purifying your hearts, you're double-minded, this is a to me is such a beautiful thing. The Jewish people, they have great reverence for the temple grounds. And when we went to Israel, we went to the area of the temple grounds, but unfortunately, they've tried to make peace with the Muslims, and the Muslims control the temple grounds, and you can only go to the on the temple grounds when they tell you you can, and so we didn't do that. But the temple grounds, sometimes I think people think, well, that's kind of like the Tabernacle Square, as they call it. I've never found it, but they call it that. The temple grounds they covered 36 acres. And that's numerous football fields. It was a huge area. And so when people say, well, like on the day of Pentecost when all the people were baptized, they say, well, there's no way that they could have baptized all those people. There wasn't enough places. Troy told me, and I don't remember the number, but I want to think he told me there were 300 mikvahs, they call them. And these mikvahs were various sizes. The pool of Bethesda was a mikvah, a pretty good sized area. But they'd have these little areas that you could go to, and they were and stone. All that area up there is stone. It's not dirt. And so they cut out these areas and they placed water in it. And so the Jewish men had to go and immerse themselves, bathe themselves in those mikvahs before they went into the temple. So symbolically, they were cleansing themselves before they went to meet God. Well, we need to be doing that constantly, because we don't meet God on one occasion. We're constantly in intercession with God, meeting God. And so they realized that they needed to cleanse the flesh and get rid of the filth of the world. And so, when Pilate, of course, whenever he refused to release Jesus and let Jesus be condemned, he said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And so he washed his hands. The entire section of James chapter 4, it can be summed up real easily. James 4 talks about things to avoid. And so when you read through that and study it yourself, just stop and think about it. He started off in 4, we looked at that last week or this morning. He said, what's the source of quarrels and conflicts of money? It's not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members. So James then he says, these are the things to avoid. And so it's pretty easy to study whenever you look at it like that. I talked about me getting salmonella. I didn't know what it was and didn't even know I had it. And when I was not feeling well and I went to take a shower, and there's 2 bathrooms over there, and the one I showered in at the time was the one that had the shower in the tub. So I was taking a shower and I got to feeling bad, and I finally wound up sitting down. And I couldn't stand back up. I couldn't get out of that bathtub. It took me an hour to get out of the bathtub. And I finally got out and I called Sherry and I said, man, I don't know what's going on. She called Lance. So anyway, I wound up in the hospital because I had salmonella. And the guy that from the state that called me, and I don't even know how he knows. I guess they have to report it. But the first thing he did was begin to question me. Where have you eaten? What restaurants did you go to? What foods have you eaten? Where did you buy them? And he traced that stuff back and found out that it was a grape that I bought at Brookshire's or Walmart, one or the other. And it's Brookshire's. Because the next time I went to Brookshire's, they had this little stand out there that had this spray you could spray your grapes with, or your fruits with, so you wouldn't have salmonella. And if you ever go to Walmart or Brookshire's and you go over there where those things are, you'll see those sacks of them, and you'll see people walk up, they'll pull one off there and taste it to see what it tastes like before they buy it. But don't do that. Don't do that. I found out that we're exposed to it all the time, and we need to be sure that we are keeping our body clean through the power of God, the power of the Holy Spirit, and forgiveness. And that's important. Another thing I was thinking about, in James 4 and verse 10, he said, humble yourself in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you. A lack of humility is so dangerous. And I got a little funny story to tell you. When I was in Oklahoma, there was a family there, Tommy Anderson, and I cannot remember his wife's name. I was trying to remember that today, and I should. And I cannot remember his wife's name. I was trying to remember that today, and I should know it, but I don't. It doesn't matter. But anyway, Tommy was about my height. James says, here's one of the problems. Here's one of the problems. Because of the lack of humility, he said, do not speak against one another. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. And what he's saying there is, in the law of Moses, what was one of the, Jesus taught this, what was the great command? When the guy came to Jesus, what's the greatest one? It's to love. To love. Yeah. And so, what James is saying here, you know that the greatest law of all is to love your Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So you're judging the law. You're saying that's not really very important. But yet love is. And so, again, when James is talking about things to avoid, he's talking about, he says one of the things is to not allow yourself to get so puffed up that you look down on others. You can't do that. And a lot of times that's what people do. There was a guy named Guy Woods that wrote one of my commentaries. He said, there's certainly no more common sin among saints and sinners today, no more obvious indication of the depravity of man than the disposition to engage in slander and detraction. So just to put it in simple words, just don't talk about people. Don't try to put people down. And I think that's very, very necessary today. We'll pick up a few more things next Sunday morning in there and get into chapter 5 and probably finish the book.